I'm going to talk about research on research. We've just, 5 weeks ago, in fact, launched this new Research on Research Institute, based at the Wellcome Trust in London, but as an international initiative with partners from now, I think, 14 different countries. And so I wanted to use it as a chance to talk about that whole field, which, as Peter says, I think hasn't had as much attention as it perhaps should have done, given its importance in ensuring that the money we all, as nations, as universities, and indeed as individual researchers, put into the research effort, trying to ensure that that effort is as effective and efficient and delivers the kind of economic, social outcomes that we want to see from the research system. So I will sort of do a quick tour through some of the things that are happening in that area and try and link it to what I understand, obviously from a distance, to be some of the debates here in New Zealand as well. But obviously if we have time, it would be great to have some questions and discussion on that. I spent most of my career, both as a practitioner and as an academic, calling myself a science policy researcher. But we have all really now become meta-researchers. This is very much the vogue in these kind of debates. And I've just put a couple of examples, really, as illustrative. One could put many up that are illustrative of that trend. The one on the left there is actually happening today and tomorrow in Melbourne. It's a big conference at the University of Melbourne, and it's the launch of a new network for interdisciplinary meta research and open science, which I think has aspirations to be regional as well as just Australian. And it's been organised by a mix of life scientists, psychologists, economists, and others who are all being brought into these questions from a concern about problems in their part of the research enterprise. Concerns about reproducibility, concerns about research integrity, p-hacking, a lack of openness, problems in the research career structure. But it's often these kind of issues that are drawing in new waves of actors and researchers and others into these debates, which is very welcome. Similarly, this other event, this was a few weeks ago at Stanford in the States, and again, this was called meta-science, another term that gets bandied around, but basically the same sort of thing going on. And this is definitely an observable trend of the last 3-4 years. A few more examples here. We've seen a number of new research centres set up. So at Stanford itself, there's the Metrics Centre. John Ioannidis, who leads that, famous for his work on problems initially in biomedical and life sciences, but increasingly across the whole research enterprise. Other examples, there's Science Magazine doing a big special on meta-research last year. These are other recent examples. The paper up there in annual reviews just came out this week from the Stanford group as a review of the field of meta-research. We're also doing a paper on this topic at the moment. So, and it's quite weird. You end up you're sort of doing meta-research on meta-research, which is it starts to get very surreal. But it's actually very good. It's a good review, the thing that's just come out this week in annual reviews. And another example there, that's at the Kellogg School of Management, as you can see from the back. Another new centre that's just been launched this month. This one headed up by an incredibly smart researcher called Dashan Wang, who has been doing loads of very interesting sort of big data social science on the science innovation system, including looking at team structures and collaboration, all sorts of interesting dynamics in these systems using new big data tools and techniques. So there's a lot going on in terms of this as a sort of field of academic endeavour. And if we take a step back and say, well, why are people doing this? Of course, there are a whole set of other bigger reasons in the science and research system, nationally and internationally, that are driving this kind of interest. First and foremost, most obviously, science in all of its multifaceted glory continues to grow and spread and complicate and diversify, and obviously you have all sorts of new and larger players entering the science system more actively and expansively, as we've seen over the last decade, China, etc. But just the volume of science continues to increase. And then we have, of course, the difficulty from a public policy, from a government perspective, of them working out how you, as a nation or as a university or as a discipline, navigate all of that opportunity. And you know, the strategy that's out for consultation here is a good example of the kinds of questions that science ministries and governments are, of course, asking all over the world. Most of the questions one sees in there are very familiar questions if you read those sorts of documents from any government. But they're important questions, and they're questions that have taken on greater salience and importance in recent times. In the UK, I did say I wasn't going to talk about Brexit, but yeah, I mean, we're having the same sorts of discussions in our own system. Clearly, there's a major political transition in the UK right now. For the science system, part of that means renegotiating, recalibrating our relationship with the European science system, which has, of course, for the last 3-4 decades been a very important source of collaborative research funding and research networks. And so you're forced to then think through in a strategic and practical sense, well, how do we navigate what comes next? We've just seen this week, again, a big review coming out there from this guy, bottom there, Adrian Smith, looking at the future of the UK's international research endeavour. So collaboration is another big part of the picture. And of course, targets to spend more. And again, here there's nice commonality between aspirations of the New Zealand government to get to 2% of GDP from 1.36 or whatever you are at the moment, and in the UK as well, we're at about 1.69, and the government aspires to get to 2.4% of GDP being spent on research. Of course, the UK strategy at one point when we were going for a no-deal Brexit looked like it would be achieved, but by crashing the economy, so keep the science spending at the same level, and of course you hit the target. But that's not generally regarded as the best way to approach hitting a major R&D target. But it's very interesting, these sort of targets. I mean, there's an interesting academic debate about the pros and cons of setting these sort of high-level, GDP targets. But they certainly, when they're taken seriously, they can be very mobilizing forces in science, research, innovation, policy debates, as I think seems to be the case here and is right now in Britain. Other things that are going on, we've seen, again, very markedly over the past 5 years, more intensive use of challenges, missions, other framing devices to shape and direct the research endeavour. So at a pan-European level, at the moment, with or without the UK, they are about to launch the next big framework programme, Horizon Europe, and that's all been shaped, well, a large part of it anyway, has been shaped around these new high-level missions. This was partly prompted by work from my former Sussex colleague, Mariana Mazzucato. But we see the same thing again in lots of systems. I put the national science challenges here in New Zealand up there, the 11 challenges. In the UK, again, we have a set of global challenges which are directed towards research as it interfaces with international priorities, particularly those in and with developing country partners. And then we have a whole set of industrial strategy challenges as well. So these devices are being used a lot more actively, a lot more intensively, and there's lots of good reasons for that, but there are also, of course, questions both in design terms, what gets to be elevated to the status of a challenge, who decides, whose voices count in those kind of discussions, how do those challenges then map onto more conventional landscapes of disciplinary and interdisciplinary endeavour. And beyond just the way we organise the funding system, there's also this sense in which the culture of science continues to evolve, and a sense also that the challenges that we see in many parts of the research system are far more acute now than they were 10 or 20 years ago, partly as a product of the other things I've just described, more science, more competitive science, more demands on science from different stakeholders, government, society, etc. Very nice piece in Nature this last week here from Philip Ball. They've been running this fantastic set of essays in Nature the last 6-7 weeks as part of Nature's 150th anniversary celebrations, but sort of these big kind of long read pieces looking quite panoramically at some of the big sweeping changes in the science system over a 150-year period. And this piece by Phil Ball, who's one of the best science writers in Britain, is a great example. And he, again, distills these challenges here in the quote I won't read out, but big things that have changed. The move from the individual sort of scientific superhero to much more team-based endeavour. Of course, the growing use of more large, complicated data sets. And then again, this need to align science and research in various ways to other societal imperatives. We then have, of course, all the other challenges in scientific communication, the rise of open research, open data, all of those related debates. Plan S is the big focus of that discussion in Europe. But a definite sense in which the paper as was is, if not entirely on the way out, is certainly under far greater scrutiny in terms of its fitness for purpose, in terms of the kinds of research, the kinds of science we want to see. Again, there's another quote there I've put up from Phil Ball. The canonical scientific article, its unified and passive voice, its closed and self-contained narrative, etc., is not the only or the best vehicle for translating and disseminating today's research. There's scope for more variety in who does this and how. And there's definitely this sense, with all the progress that we've made in terms of open access, open research, that we're still, in this transition phase from the old system to the new, and we can see the contours of what will come, but we're not quite there yet. But it's exciting as well as frustrating at times, the failure for that system to move more quickly. Another great look at this from a social science perspective, just to be so critical of social science as a social scientist. A lovely book came out last year from Matt Salverson and colleagues on the problem, these sorts of problems as they've played out in the social sciences. And they have this great quote that I love talking about social science. Never before in the history of humanity have so many written so much while having so little to say to so few, which is a sobering thing to reflect upon, even if we don't entirely agree with it, and I don't entirely agree with it. So then when we think about the scientific culture and the research culture that we're in, of course, we're familiar with many of the problems, but they have all, of course, also received far greater attention over the last few years. I mentioned earlier the way in which many of the energy, the activity around meta-research has really been driven by researchers themselves sitting in their patch of the scientific landscape and seeing those problems at close hand and then deciding to do something about it. Firstly, by analysing and understanding in a more robust, empirically grounded way what is actually happening. Why are people, what is driving people to engage in p-hacking, or what's driving the fixation on narrow singular metrics like the journal impact factor, and then also, of course, to do something about it. Lots, I won't go through all these as examples, but lots of great work that's been done on this in recent years. I know both Peter and I are big fans of this nice essay that Dan Sarevitz from Arizona State wrote 3-4 years ago now, called Saving Science, which is a great sweeping, polemical ride through all of the problems and limitations in the contemporary research landscape. But there's lots of other work going on, lots of more quantitative empirical work as well as more work that's driven more by a desire to change the way the system's organised. Peter mentioned my own engagement with the metrics debate. This was a review, the metric tide, that I did for the UK government in 2014, 2015, which again was prompted by this same set of concerns, really. Here you had far greater possibilities, clearly, from new sources of data on the research system, both conventional bibliometrics, but also all of the new so-called alternative metrics that we now have at our fingertips, and real questions, real dilemmas for policymakers, for funders, for university leaders in how much weight to place on those different measures, how to incorporate them in a sensible way that obviously, supports what you want to see in the system but doesn't create perverse incentives or drive other problems within research systems. And of course, we're still living through those tensions. They don't go away. And then a couple of other things, and I'll talk about what we're doing about all this. I mentioned the big data side. I mean, the other thing we've, of course, now got at our disposal are far more sophisticated tools and analytic platforms with which to interrogate the research system. I mentioned here the digital science tool. I mean, it's one of several, but it is an interesting one insofar as they have this platform, this tool called Dimensions, which some of you may be familiar with. But it's a sort of evolution on from conventional databases like Web of Science, which focused on citations primarily, in that it tries, as the name suggests, to give you a more multi-dimensional picture of the research system. So alongside data on citations, which has been the backbone of bibliometrics, again, you won't be able to see because of the light, but you've got the publication stuff. You then have data on grants, patents, clinical trials, and policy documents, which is which draws on the altmetric tool that you'll be familiar with, the donut you now see on articles. And if you work in a policy relevant field of social science or environmental science, or any area that might be used in policy, climate science, seeing uses of your work captured and recognised alongside conventional scholarly uses, other academics citing your work, is a really important and potentially transformative, positive use of metrics to incentivise more policy-relevant, societally relevant, challenge-oriented research. So it's just one small example of what we're starting to see happen through some of these new platforms. And within research funders, one other big thing that's changed is they themselves, as funders, are investing, some of them at least, far more heavily in their own in-house data science analytic teams, which is really quite a new thing. So Wellcome, I'll say more about it because we're working with Wellcome now on this stuff, but prior to doing the Research on Research Institute, which I'll speak about 2 years ago, Wellcome decided to build and set up its own in-house data science team, basically to do analytics on their own. So Wellcome Trust, for those who aren't familiar, is the largest charitable foundation one of the largest charitable foundations in the world supporting science, certainly the largest in the UK, has 28.5 billion British pounds under endowment, spends about 1.4 billion a year on research. And so they set this team up to really just do this stuff on their own portfolio, but to do it in-house rather than having to rely on other commercial products. Other new funders, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, who have obviously grown out of the Facebook, that's sort of charitable, it says the charitable arm of Facebook, that's probably some sort of libel to the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. But anyway, it's the charitable trust that Mark Zuckerberg and his wife have set up. And they have bought and incorporated into it Meta, which is another big research data startup, and they have an enormous team as well in CZI of data scientists, doing this stuff on the investments that they make. So it's a sort of new approach to funding, a much more data-informed, data-rich, evidence-informed approach to the design of funding systems, the evaluation of research funding than we would traditionally have seen. All of this sort of leads you to this rather fuzzy, emergent debate about meta-research, research on research. I hesitate to call it a new field. Some people sort of talk about this as if it really isn't a new field, and I'll say more about that in a moment. It's been around a long time, but it certainly, as I hope I've conveyed, has received a big influx of fresh energy and dynamism in recent years, and all of this, particularly the data side of it, is new in terms of the methodological opportunities that all of that creates. In terms of defining what it is, INGSA is probably the best. He's done several papers that sort of define meta-research, and certainly someone like John uses meta-research and research on research fairly interchangeably. And I would probably do the same. As he says here, meta-research, the study of research itself, its methods, reporting, reproducibility, evaluation, and incentives. But as I say, it really isn't new. When we were thinking about setting something up, we decided to go with the term research on research quite deliberately, because in a way we felt, you can tell me right whether it comes across that way, we felt it was a bit less hubristic in terms of not sounding like it was sort of trying to overcomplicate something that really is quite simple. It's just turning the lens of research back on the research enterprise and trying to be more robust and evidence-informed in the way we run, design, evaluate research systems. But I would definitely locate meta-research, research on research very much in this continuum of developments, which I won't go through in detail because of time, but go right back through the emergence of philosophy, history of science, the sort of flowering of STS and various more sociological approaches to the science system in the 60s and through the 70s, and then the rise of innovation studies through into the 90s. I mean, Sprue, where I was based at Sussex, was a real pioneer as a university centre in Europe doing that kind of innovation studies work, innovation systems. And then more recently, concepts like the science of science policy, which have been big in the US, and then the emergence much more recently of these terms like meta-research and meta-science, etc. So it is a continuum. There's been a bit of a debate and a bit of a sort of reaction from some of the, how's it called, more traditional. It seems funny to call a community like STS traditional, because, of course, STS itself was quite transgressive of, history, philosophy of science when it sort of first burst forward in the 60s and 70s. But there was a very interesting thing going on while the Stanford meeting was happening in September. At the very same time, and this is reflective really of the extent to which this whole field is still, is diverse and quite fragmented. So you had this whole bunch of people at Stanford meeting for 4 days to discuss meta-science. And at exactly the same time in New Orleans, it was the annual 4S meeting, the Social Studies of Science meeting, which brings together thousands of STS scholars from around the world. And then also at the same time in Rome, the community of scientometricians and bibliometricians were having their annual shindig. And so it was just very interesting seeing the kind of, debate going on social media and elsewhere between these three different events. And in the closing plenary of the 4S meeting in New Orleans, someone, a very good STS scholar, stood up and talked about things like the meta-science meeting Columbusing STS, claiming something to be new when of course it wasn't. And I think that is quite an important challenge for people in the meta-research business to reflect upon. There definitely is a tendency, at least in branding terms, to, I think, rather overclaim novelty, and it's something we're trying, in what we do at least, to avoid. At the same time, as I hope I've also conveyed in what I've been saying, I do think there are certain, quite important features of the contemporary research landscape that are quite profoundly different from the research landscape in 1975 or whenever. So it's, as ever, a balance of these things. To sort of try and put that in a slightly more evidence-based picture, we ourselves, as I say, have been doing research on research on research. We've been trying to understand these different fields, how they relate to one another, who's doing research on research and where. And so I just wanted to give you a very quick flavour of some of that. This is work that we've done with our colleagues through the research on research at Leiden. There's a big centre of scientometric studies, the Centre for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden, who we work with. So I won't go through the method and stuff, because it's not a great thing for an evening lecture. But what we've done here, this is basically a picture. It's a visualisation of the whole landscape of research. We've gone through a big exercise to try and identify where are the clusters of activity that one could call research on research or meta-research. And it's, it's quite interesting. And I mean, not that surprising in some ways, but you see that big red clump is people doing work in and around STS, innovation studies, higher education studies. And then you've got these sort of smaller but significant clusters coming through into sort of social behavioural science. So that would be the sort of psychologists worrying about reproducibility and openness. And then the life science is also worrying about reproducibility and wastage in the medical research system, etc. And then, coming up, you've got the more computer science, data science side of things, a little pocket in maths doing this sort of work. It's much more sparse in the kind of physical. I got more. Hang on, there we are. That's better with the big labels. There you are. Sorry, it's clearer now. The blue up there is the other physical science. There isn't so much of it there, but it's quite interesting anyway, seeing sort of who's doing this stuff and how and what they call it when they do it, how they link up, how they don't. And we've done stuff on the different terms that people use, which again I won't go through. So that's sort of the kind of academic picture, but I just want to sort of turn it on its head a bit and say, so, why is this stuff important from a funder perspective? If you're a research funder, why do you care about this stuff? And the reason the thing we've just set up is based at the Wellcome Trust and not based in a university is that we felt it was, there was a particular opportunity to bring the academic capacity that is growing in these fields into the closer orbit of the actual research funders, so that the work could then, more readily be used to inform and shape funder strategies, funder policies, the way in which funders dish out money, the way in which they evaluate who they give money to, and also evaluate how well that money has been spent. And from a funder perspective, this is just a distillation really of key points. So Wellcome Trust did a big scoping exercise over an 18-month period looking at this sort of field from a funder perspective and talking to lots of other funders. And their main conclusions here are on this slide, that from their perspective as a funder, while there is clearly more work being done on these questions, the evidence where it exists is very fragmented. These are often quite niche studies. Someone will do an analysis of a particular funding scheme in a particular country at a particular time, and it'll be interesting, but it'll be quite hard to generalize in a robust, reliable way from that to a funding scheme in a different country, in a different system, with a different objective. So there was a real need from a funder perspective to do larger scale, more comparative, more longitudinal work on some of these dimensions of the research system. Very little of the stuff that does get funded is really designed in a way that can usefully inform funding policy and practice. And thirdly, and this very much has influenced what we've then gone on to do, that to really make this stuff useful, funders need to be treated not simply as a source of writing checks, but themselves as collaborators, co-designers, co-producers of this kind of work. So it's one of these sort of areas where the role of funders is rather different to the role that they often occupy in respect of the areas of research that they fund. So Wellcome sort of dabbled in this a bit, and they put a bit of money in, some sort of pilot research on research awards. And then at the end of September, we launched this new thing, Rory, which I'll just say a final bit about before I wrap up. So this is a partnership between Wellcome, 2 universities, and Digital Science, but not an exclusive one. They're simply the people who sort of got it going. What we've done then around those 4 is assemble this consortium. We focused initially on research funders, but of course you could bring publishers and others into this sort of enterprise. It's not, there are other key actors, universities of course, as well as institutions. But we focused firstly on the funders because it just seemed that they were in the best position to make the biggest impact. And also a lot of them are sitting on very rich data sets which often don't see the light of day. They're all the data they have on peer review processes, grant selection processes. It varies from funder to funder, and private foundations behave differently from public funding agencies. But in general, there's a lot that could be done just to even make better use of the data that does exist already. And then also, of course, to do the kind of larger scale, more comparative work that I was alluding to earlier. So there's a range of players involved. And as Peter says, we're hoping, it wasn't a deliberate objective of my trip here, but it might be a nice byproduct of my trip here that we end up bringing one of the funders from the New Zealand system in as well. The Australian Research Council are involved in terms of other countries, at least not too far away. The aims of the new thing, I won't go through in detail, but to build capacity to connect, as I said, academic capabilities to the needs and demands of funders. So it's not, it is really about brokering the kind of academic potential that is growing in a number of different places, a number of different countries, a number of different disciplines, connecting that better to the demands and needs of funders and policymakers, and to work with those partners to experiment, to co-produce, to test new tools, indicators, funding modes, and evaluation frameworks. That's a sort of diagram that tries to explain how it all works. There are three themes to what we're doing: careers, cultures, and decision-making, but I'll sort of explain those with some actual examples. So, a big theme, and touched on this earlier when we talked about challenges, a big theme of what we're looking at is how do funders and policy makers as well set priorities in research systems, and this can include questions around how they use things like challenges and missions, and also how do you achieve or how do you even get a measure of balance across a funding system. This is a huge debate right now in the British system, and it features, of course, in the consultation document that's out here, how you think about balance, because it's not straightforward. In the UK 2 years ago, they redesigned our whole funding system, and we went through a whole process of a new parliamentary act to create this new organisation, UK Research and Innovation, and enshrined in the legislation is a requirement on UK research and innovation to maintain balance in the UK funding system. And of course, one person's balance is another person's, gross, distorted, favoritism to this bit of the system over that bit of the system. So it's an interesting and very live debate, I think, in many countries. And of course, we need to think about balance in many ways. Balance between disciplines, rather old and tired debates about balance between pure and applied, which are in fact more complicated. Balance between undirected research and more goal or mission-driven research is perhaps a better way to think about it in the current climate. Then when you have those goals or missions or challenges, the balance between them, how much do you give in resource terms, in profile terms to each individual mission or challenge. Balance then across different economic sectors, if we're talking more about the innovation parts of the system, across different nations and regions. And then Peter mentioned, we've been doing particular work on these questions with respect to health research and medical research, which is a very interesting arena in which there's also a lot of important questions about the balance between the sort of more fundamental biomedical bits of those systems and then other areas of health research, social, environmental, behavioural, public health, etc., which often don't really get surfaced and well, at least certainly in Britain, they don't get surfaced and talked about as explicitly as they perhaps should. So these are the kind of questions that we're looking at. To give a sort of example, this is the report Peter mentioned in his introduction that we published last year, the Biomedical Bubble, which was an attempt to, in a sort of deliberately sort of quite provocative way, to sort of poke a bit at that question around biomedical and health research and say, well, are we sure that the balance of investment we're making is the right balance, relative both to the actual health needs of the nation and also to the robustness of the actual pull through into the pharmaceutical sector and other more applied parts of the commercial health system. And it was quite a sort of challenging report, and we drew on work by people like Jack Scannell. That graph there is so-called E-Rooms law, the opposite of Moore's law, showing the how basically R&D productivity in the pharmaceutical industry has plummeted. And this very interesting work we did as well, looking at the way in which, there's always this argument in health research spending that there's a multiplier effect. If government spends £1, then industry will spend £2, £3 or whatever. And actually, if you look at this particular, this is in the UK, I don't know how it would apply here, that link has broken. It broke a few years ago, and it's continuing to diverge. And yet the kind of political policy debate about biomedical research and where to spend health money hasn't really kept pace with that. And this is largely because, big pharmaceutical companies moving their R&D out of the UK, and of course this is also something that's likely to speed up because of Brexit. And then on the regional side, again, sorry, this is a bit small, but this was again stuff that we did. We looked by city at where health and medical research spending takes place in the UK, and you see 90% of it goes to 1960s, 55% goes to London, Cambridge and Oxford. And of course, then if you map where are the biggest health needs in the country, they're not. So, and these relationships aren't simple or straightforward, but it's important to ask these kinds of questions of research systems. And they're questions that often research funders and many research policymakers are quite uncomfortable having a sort of explicit and data-informed debate about, because there are lots of vested interests of various kinds in the way in which research money is allocated that potentially get destabilised by these kinds of questions. So these are examples of research on research work under priority setting. Another big theme is decision making. So I mean that's sort of decision making as it applies to the kind of national meta level of the system. How do you decide where to put money if you're a national funding agency? But even then, at the level of individual grant schemes or other actors in the system, there's obviously lots to examine in terms of how processes of allocation, selection, evaluation take place. All of the questions around, forms of implicit bias in peer review, just problems in peer review more generally, and the opportunities of different modes of funding within those systems. So, I put a few examples here. The stuff that the Health Research Council here is doing is interesting in terms of a sort of lottery, as I understand it at least, a lottery element within their sort of explorer grant schemes. The Volkswagen Foundation in Germany have been, they're about halfway through a really interesting trial of partial randomization in some of their funding schemes. So this is the idea that, as long as proposals get to a certain level of basic, quality and coherence, they then go into a pot and they're randomly picked, rather than relying, because of the marginal difference in quality that can be discerned among good proposals by a panel or by a peer review process is so subject to different sorts of bias or Matthew effects, etc., that potentially a lottery is just, this is the hypothesis at least, but there has been very little empirical data on these kind of things. So that's all quite interesting. And then work on large teams and team size and which sizes of team, which size of grant are most efficient. The guy I mentioned at Kellogg in the States, Dashan Wang's been doing loads of work on this very, very interesting question, because there's definitely been a drift towards, certainly in Europe, towards ever larger, fewer larger grants as a feature of the system. And there's actually quite strong empirical evidence to suggest that that's not necessarily the direction you always want to go in. You need to preserve diversity in a system. And then, of course, a whole related but slightly different set of questions around research culture, openness, diversity, inclusion, all of the issues around gender and research. And fascinating, that paper up there at the top, Fiona Murray and colleagues at MIT, really interesting. This paper came out a few months ago, looking at doing textual analysis on the words used in proposals by male and female PI-led bids, and finding that there was a discernible difference in the kinds of words that male-led proposals used about their research. In essence, men were more prone to bullshit and talk up their work in more hyperbolic terms. And so very interesting, what does that then play through into what happens in terms of the funding process? So this kind of stuff, very, very interesting and quite subtle, important ways of looking at what goes on in funding systems, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots going on. It's a very interesting field. The Research on Research is an attempt to try and bring different people together to do it. We're very pleased Nature did a nice editorial endorsing what we were trying to do. We're very much hoping, as I say, to work with Peter, with SciPods, with others here, and to include New Zealand in that conversation and in that debate. And I hope what I've done in a short while there tonight is just give you a flavour of why we think it is an exciting and dynamic field that holds real exciting academic potential as well as real relevance to policy and practice. Thank you.